Welcome to Baltic Spotlight, hosted by the Joint Baltic American National Committee, highlighting voices and ideas concerning Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and U.S. Baltic relations. Today we welcome Dr. Sandis Sraders, an expert on Russian foreign and security studies, U.S. foreign policy, and the role of small states in international affairs. He has served as Secretary General of the Latvian Transatlantic Organization, Project Coordinator for the German Marshall Fund, and Director of Strategic Projects, Sales, and Advertising at Latvia's Radio. Currently, he is a researcher and lecturer at the Baltic Defence College in Tartu, Estonia, on Russian military and strategic studies. Our Baltic Spotlight event, titled Shaping American Attitudes from Re-Independence to NATO Accession, was hosted over Zoom and consisted of a discussion on the evolving U.S. policy towards the Baltic region and forecasting the ideal role of the United States in European security. The podcast was recorded on May 30th, 2024. We hope you enjoyed the program.
The title of the discussion really mentions precisely that when we regained our independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union, our first task was really to make sure no occupation of the Baltic states ever happens again, to make sure our independence and sovereignty and territorial integrity is irreversible. Therefore, we set our sights on NATO first, the organization, which is led by the United States and attended also by the other major European powers. And I think it was also a very, very important geopolitical moment, because after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were so many newly independent states or former Soviet territories or post-Soviet countries, or the countries that simply gained independence as a result because the Soviet Union collapsed. It was not a community or the union of the states that was held together by any common interest. It was rather the oppression and suppression of the people and different kind of rights within the Central Eastern Europe, the Baltic region, and everywhere where the Soviet Union had its borders. Before the U.S. has never been very active internationally, and I think very active foreign policy was exception to the rule. For example, around 1970s, when Russia was undergoing very important transition, 1970, 1918, the revolution, which allowed for the Baltic states to declare independence and then immediately to get into the independence fights until 1920s, where each of them were supporting each other, and therefore the independence was possible. So one is the diplomats declaring the independence, but actually you need to fight for it and stand for it. Then the United States really didn't understand what to do. With whom should they talk in Europe? With whom should they talk in Russia? With the people, with the Bolsheviks, Mensheviks, the coming communist government, or the opposition, the Russian Empire. And the foreign policy also for the Baltic states and others was really perplexing until the First World War. Until the Second World War, the Americans were absent in Europe, and I think those were the conditions that led to the Second World War. And I call this foreign policy as malign from 1970 until 1940s, because of the U.S. absence. Many other wars were happening in Europe, And the result was Second World War, where the United States was forced to be involved because of the foreign policy mistakes before. And the next stage is from 1945 until 1991, when the United States really couldn't do anything about the Baltic independence unless the U.S. foreign policy makers decided to start the war with the Soviet Union, and therefore the foreign policy could be just benign, meaning it was possible for the United States to allow the exile government to work in Washington, the organizations to develop in the United States, such as American Latvian Association, which was really important and home for our future ambassadors, like, for example, Ojārs Eriks Kalniņš, who was an ally employee and then the first ambassador after the Soviet collapse. The redemption or the possibility to bring freedom and justice and democracy to the Baltic states came after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the period from 1991 until 2004. That was the time when the Americans also helped to rid the Baltic states from the Soviet Russian military remnants until 1995. After this period, Bill Clinton came to Riga to celebrate this occasion. His daughter went to Riga Central Market to buy the flowers in the colors of the American flag. And I think this visit was really nicely received. And I think also those periods are very closely related to the life of the Bill Clinton in different kind of sources and literature. You know, I think by 1960s, I think between 60 65, that was time when Carl mentioned Joint Baltic American National Committee was created, correct, Carl, right? So he, as a student, was walking around Washington, and everybody who was protesting and supporting the cause of the Latvian, Estonian, and Lithuanian independence, he specifically referred to one lady protesting in Washington. He was saying that his impression was that the lady was one brick shy of the full wall, and that she was not all right with the delusional vision that Baltic states could ever become free. Then he was the president-elect after the Soviet collapse, and he was actually the one who was coordinating the policies to rid the former Soviet territories from the nuclear weapons, like the Budapest Memorandum. But he also helped to rid the Baltic states from the Russian military remnants, which gave the real independence for the Baltic states and a possibility to launch this transition all the way until the EU and NATO membership in 2004. His misbehavior helped the Baltic states to gain more attention for the administration at the White House when he had this affair with Monica Lewinsky, and I think she's not receiving enough information from attention from the Baltic states. There were very few international governments willing to work with Bill Clinton's government, but the Baltic states were always open to and willing to work with Americans. And then the Baltic American Charter was signed, which Bill Clinton personally very much supported. And these conditions are visible in the former State Secretary Madeleine Albright's memoirs when she was telling that, you know, how the family, the administration, and the foreign policy establishment went through those challenges and what were the options left until the next election in 2000 when Bush Jr. Took over the relay to become the new president of the United States. It was important also, Americans put all three Baltic states in the same basket. You know, Estonians always pretended to be more Nordic Vikings, even though everybody knows Latvians are the real Vikings under the auspices of Sweden. And also during the Kurland times, you know, we sailed and built wonderful ships towards Ukraine and also across the Atlantic to gain such important colonies as Tobago and Trinidad. Lithuanians always presented themselves as a bigger entity and therefore more important and politically more influential, which it might be partially right, aligned with the Central Eastern Europe, and Latvia was always the one in the middle and without any kind of clear foreign policy direction. And then Latvian foreign policy makers and leadership at the beginning of the 90s said, we just want to be together with Americans. And maybe this was the reason why we, in terms of reforms and adaptation to the EU membership by 1999, 2000, were in better shape actually than Estonia and Lithuania. And therefore, we were much more adapted to become a EU member state. And this adaptation was very difficult to the EU criteria to become a membership, but it gave a very important advantage. If we can qualify for the EU membership, any country globally can call the Baltic states democracies, because we used to be former Soviet countries without any real democratic traditions, free media, civil society, anti-corruption bodies, free elections, and all of those things that didn't happen during the Soviet Union years. The moment or the opening came after 9/11, when the international security system changed dramatically. We know what happened, and until then, the Americans were using the unipolar moment or preponderance to enlarge or extend their international cooperation networks through institutions. Americans could simply afford to do so because there was no power inside that could challenge the United States. But then after 9/11, even the Europeans split into a coalition of the willing and willing together with Russians, apart from Russians, and China slowly was bidding for its moment. But the years 2000 until 2005, 2006, especially, were the possibility for the Baltic states to quickly adapt to the EU membership and to the NATO membership to get into the European social economic stability structures and also NATO structures. And it was important the doors were open to both organizations because Europeans were concerned about the Baltic security, but Americans had to make sure the enlargement of the transatlantic community or NATO is based on democratic principles. And it was important for the Baltic states to project ourselves in a similar way. 2007, Putin's speech in Munich Security Conference, he was already lamenting about the United States ignorance, preponderance, and unipolarity. 2008, the little war that shook the world, or Russia occupied 20% of the Georgia's territory. Then came 2014, Crimea seizing of the Ukrainian territory, in the years all the way until 2022, Russia was already drifting apart from the United States, from closer cooperation, from Western structures, increasingly presenting itself as a future adversary. And same patterns we can witness also in relations with China, especially between the United States and PRC. Today, we are witnessing the international community or global community that is fractured, multipolar, I would say, where one polar is the West and the rest is simply the rest, and we wouldn't call it even the East. It's basically if you're democratic, if you align with the Western structures, ideals, and principles, if you embrace liberal democratic order, and those kinds of cooperations or alliances are not based just on the European Union and NATO. There are also others, for example, Japan, Australia, I would say India, and other countries, which I call the Western derivatives, those that are official or non-official members of the transatlantic security and cooperation community with similar principles, with high respect for the human rights, rule of law, the borders of the other states, which should not be revised, and sovereignty of the other people, which should not be challenged in any way. So the question is like, what is the U.S. foreign policy task or the challenge for the next president, or which administration should the Baltic states favor? I would like to refer to one conversation we had at the Baltic Defence College during the Trump's presidency. And for the Baltic states and Poland, it doesn't really matter which of the presidents win the election in 1990 in November 5. The most important is that the Baltic states can indulge really close cooperation with the United States. And I think it would, having Donald Trump as a president would be beneficial because we comply with all the transatlantic security cooperation principles. And during his 4 years as a president, he has done a lot to sanction Russia. And actually, during his watch, Russia didn't do anything like it did in February 2022. Then American foreign policy establishment could project some unpredictability. And the cooperation, especially between Poland, which is focal point for the Baltic security, was really good. Donald Trump also made it clear that all countries had to spend 2% on defense and comply with the transatlantic security cooperation principles. Otherwise, the Baltic states or those that are bordering with Russia or attending their security responsibly are paying for those that are residing in the middle of NATO, like, for example, a safe neighborhood for Benelux countries or other countries means that they can spend less on defense because they don't have such neighbors as the Baltic states have to the east, to the north and the south. For example, for Latvia or Estonia or Lithuania, the neighbors are good and the ones that you can wish for any country to have. But we are residing on this focal fault line between east and the west, and therefore we are facing different kind of security challenges. And at this point, the foreign policy that would be desirable for the Baltic states would be bold American approach to Ukraine. If Americans and the Europeans will not work together to secure Ukraine, to secure the full sovereignty and territorial integrity before seizing Crimea of Ukraine, then the Americans and Europeans will present themselves to the revisionist powers as weak and countries that are ready to appease adversaries. We already know that Munich Agreement giving something to Hitler, other dictators and autocrats and the leaders that are far from rational have never worked in history and actually have presented themselves as really bad cases. Therefore, for the next incumbent and president-elect, the challenge would be to forge closer cooperation with the transatlantic security community. There are many fault lines, like, for example, Central Eastern Europe, Hungary and Slovakia are drifting apart from the European cooperation structures, even though they are reliable partners and participating at different kind of security projects, like, for example, Baltic air policing. But then, since some of those countries are presenting themselves as worse Europeans, not bad, worse, there's always a way back. Then there's always the possibility that during the times of crisis or the declaration of war, something might not work out. Countries might have caveats, different kind of excuses to uphold the collective cooperation principles. Same goes with the United States. No organization prevails over the Congress decision to declare war, even though American foreign policy establishment has been sufficient enough, to make decisions and avoid congressional support for multiple years since World War II. And such wars have been possible to help uphold the Article 5. But then the solidarity among the Europeans and fair burden sharing is an important obligation for all NATO member states, including North American countries, like, for example, Canada. The aspect that Canada is always following and willing to support the United States, but is spending 1.75 in the future on defense, is not enough. Germany, militarization and enhancement of the military capabilities, probably the moment is already bygone. 2 years into war with Ukraine, debating Zeitenwende slowly and incrementally, Scholzization of the European mindset in terms of support to Ukraine is not what Europe really needs. We need really bold approach to our security affairs, something that might come actually from the Central Eastern Europe. Therefore, I very much hope that the next Secretary General comes from this region, not from the Benelux or some of the Southern European countries that are not facing the same existential challenges as those countries that I would call the 3Cs initiative region: Romania, Bulgaria, and the others, Baltic states, newcomers, like, for example, Finland or Sweden, or any other country that is aware of the challenges that we are facing to the east, but also the challenges that we face, such as migration and domestic challenges. Southern Eastern Europe are witnessing in a simultaneous way. So Ukraine is number one, because the loss of Ukraine would mean also the impetus for Putin to try to challenge NATO. And here we have to look at the Baltic states as the smaller and possibly weaker countries in the eyes of Putin, as well as other regions. For example, if you look further south, Romania and Bulgaria might look at each other and the region more particularly as competition. For example, Turkey and Black Sea, Romania and Black Sea, those are the countries of the same region, but also the same alliance with rather diverging interests. With the United States absence, I think the outcomes might be detrimental for the collective security and the shared interests of them all. At the moment, I'm engaged in preparing the different kind of articles with Latvian Institute of International Affairs, as well as there are many requests from different kind of publishers. So what should or could the United States foreign policy domestic conditions be before and after the election and work in those aspects? I think those are all moving targets. What I can say, the weird thing for me as a U.S. foreign policy observer is the conclusion I must make that the United States usually has the presidency and vice presidency, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. But for the first time in history, the United States has co-presidency. And the co-president is very influential because the president cannot get through the policies that are in the best interest for the Transatlantic Security Committee, like, for example, the military support to Ukraine, and then the political decisions that would improve the efficiency of this military support by allowing the Ukrainian military to strike the targets inside of Russia military bases, and those institutions, I would say, that are responsible for the war Russia is launching against Ukraine and also other countries. And such policy would also allow populations and societies, like, for example, Georgians, to choose their own way and without the Russian influences to craft their own European or transatlantic integration path without Russian puppet governments, like, for example, the presence of Bedzina Ivanishvili as a lawmaker and businessmen inviting the Chinese capital to build U.S. ports that were intended for the European and American investors. I think that's a very vivid example, and those are the challenges that are really important for the Baltic states, Ukraine and Georgia, and those two countries have been on the radar for the Baltic, Polish, Eastern European communities. And the foreign policy that the European Union used to have since 2009, the Eastern Partnership, is dead now, but still we have to find ways to work with those countries and to support them in the ways that we can. I'll stop here probably, and I'm open to questions and answers from you. I saw there was something in the chat already. I'll have a look.
Yeah, sure. So the first question in the chat is concerning your comments on a potential Trump presidency. So it's from our colleague from the CEC, Diana Vitudis. She says, if you say that Trump was good for NATO during his presidency, do you still think he is supportive NATO of Ukraine? And I guess to follow up, you did say that success in terms of a transatlantic relationship would require a bold American approach to Ukraine. So do you see a bold approach to Ukraine still possible under a second Trump term?
The most interesting thing about Trump during his presidency was, and probably beneficial also for the Europeans, was that the Europeans had to understand we cannot free ride and we cannot rely on the United States security guarantees alone, that we have to be responsible in terms of our security, that we have to make sure we spend more on defense, that we build up our military structures, not to rely on the United States leadership when we need it, but also to support the collective interests when, with the rising amount and also the roster of challenges, like, for example, China, the Middle East, the Russian Federation, the migration crisis caused by Angela Merkel's invitation for the Maghreb and the Northern African countries to visit Europe, another aspect. So I think his presidency was really good for the Transatlantic Security Alliance. And at some point, there is a yes or no answer, because if the principle suggests each country must spend 2% on defense, then in a long-term perspective, no excuse is valid. It can be only a short-term policy for any country to opt out from this principle, like some kind of very specific unexpected crisis, which could give the reason to opt out from those principles, but also in the short term already. For Germany, it's very difficult to justify why it's not keeping up with the security principles. For France, probably just a matter of principle to spend 1.99% on defense instead of 2%, but probably it would not make a very big difference. Trump also, when it comes to different kind of policies, you do something or you don't do anything. Presently, he has all the support with the United States Congress to do the policies without being the president the Ukraine badly needs. And I think all Republicans or majority of Republicans are already siding with Trump as the next president. And the decision for the United States to send support, the military support, 61 billion, also depends on Trump's disguised or quiet consent to support the Ukrainian war effort against the Russian Federation. Therefore, I think he is really beneficial for NATO. First, his messages and signals to the European that you have to attend your own security matters are important. And the second, when he supports something, he supports until the end. If Europeans shouldn't wait for the Americans to start supporting Ukraine first and then follow in the footsteps, there can be European strategic autonomy. And I think with Trump, the Europeans will become more equal partners to the Americans. And Trump will also see the benefit for in closer cooperation with the European Union or European countries, members, non-members, everyone.
I think we see a comment from Martin Zanderson, so you have the floor.
Hi, yes, I had a question. Increasingly, we hear about Europe taking the initiative on reactivating the military-industrial complex in terms of production of munitions. But I'm hearing that in parallel with conversations about the EU forming its own collective security or collective defense alliance. And my question is, do you see that as complementary or conflictory with NATO?
Martin, it's a really great question. And in 2010, I had the possibility to work for the Latvian Defense Ministry. They hired me to write a project for the CBRN capability, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear threats. I was tasked to investigate the use of the EU funds for those capabilities. But these types of things could be possible only within the European Defense Agency. And therefore, I had to research also the capabilities that were the result of this European defense cooperation. And I would like to call the collective European defense cooperation and the results it has delivered, like its mobile phone capability, nothing else. Because there's very little unity in Europe in terms of leadership, who does what and where. We mostly disagree, then the burden sharing is very difficult, then we lack the capabilities, and eventually we end up shuffling papers, and there are very few outcomes. But with the United States, I mean, the principle is simple. If any of the European countries is under attack or in trouble, the United States will support us. And if the United States chooses to go to Afghanistan, Iraq, or anywhere, any of the European countries will follow. And I think this principle has been really good. Some countries wanted always to opt out from this cooperation, like, for example, Germany and France, at the time of the U.S. unnecessary wars in the Middle East, Iraq and Afghanistan. But eventually they have come to the terms with the United States leadership and other aspects. Europe alone cannot attend its security needs. I think the United States is indispensable because of the leadership, and Europe is a good ally for the United States because no single country can ever lead Europe. And with the British Brexit and leaving of the European Union, I think the country that was in a position to make sure Europe moves, reforms, or has a direction is out from the European cooperation structures, and therefore we have to rely on American bolder political support in terms of the European security pillar. I hope I answered your question. It's a complex question. The capabilities are there.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, my main concern is I hear these discussions about collective European defense as potentially being distracting from the need to stay aligned within the NATO circle.
I mean, we already saw how this leading from behind worked out when the French were running out of the missiles. They were hastily calling Americans to lend some, and then the Germans were not okay with the French leadership. Or there were so many caveats the Germans were having because they were afraid of the Second World War demons. Therefore, they behaved in such a manner as they do today. I think not supporting the common European good or interest is a crime for any European country, like with Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
But then the regional interest, Germany belonging more to the central Baltic Polish region, and then Britain, Northern Europe, and France is basically a Mediterranean country. I think this cooperation divergence and divergence of the security interest doesn't really support common European security cooperation. That's why the United States is indispensable.
And if there are no other hands raised, if I could ask a follow-up question, your views on some of the more, how we should say it, recalcitrant European allies in terms of Hungary or Turkey, who seem to want to play both sides on the Ukraine question.
Yeah, I mean, it is interesting because Turkey is interested in enhancing its role in the Black Sea region. It's a Black Sea power. We can see it like with the grain and exports and access to the ports. It has played and supported the Ukraine in many ways. It is a very important military ally and one of the most important armies for the collective defense, and especially now with the Middle East as an Arab nation. I think it plays indispensable role in bridging this Western Middle East cooperation, which is very difficult to explain. It's Middle East is like a bag of cats. You step in one place and something is meowing, and then you step in another and something is hissing, and nothing is ever right. And taking any side is impossible because the next day you are on opposite side and confused. It's like, why is it that the day before I was somewhere else? But I think Hungary will come to terms with the European cooperation principles. I would call it a one-man show. Hungarians are going increasingly on streets. One of the authors I highly respect, like Friedman, he has written about the flashpoints in Europe when the fracturing might start. He has written also extensively about Hungary, 1956, how the country was changing, and the aspiration for the Western cooperation and basically embrace of the Western standards by the society. I think Orban sees the moment to give away the banks at the financial and economic crisis 2009 2010, when everybody was supporting the banks, and I think it gave the credit that allowed him to consolidate the legal system and other resources inside of Hungary to enhance his power, but it won't last forever. He's living in such neighborhood that is inclined to reform and change. And he has enough challengers inside the country, society, the first challenger, and possibly some bright leaders in the future too.
Thank you,
Excellent.
Valdius.
I think we have Carl Hakijokes with the next question. You have the floor.
Yes. So I saw an interesting question raised by the Estonian news program Otse Uutisen Maja, where they asked about the possibility of us working on integration in the European Union, possibly backfiring in the future, such as qualified majority, because some other countries like Germany might be more hesitant. And then a hypothetical example was given in that interview where they said that if the qualified majority of the European Union voted against our interests when it came to Ukraine, that was the focus of the question. So I'm curious, in the case that the European Union decides to not act in Ukraine's best interests, let's say because of Russian influence in Slovakia or Hungary or the hesitation in Germany, how should the Baltics continue to support Ukraine even if the European Union or most of the member states aren't in favor?
I think it's a really good question, and the European Union is so complex that even the designers of the European structures, the French, really don't understand how the mechanism is working. The country that could reform the European is gone from the European institutional cooperation, the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom basically wanted us in uh, because the Brits saw us as the Nordic countries who would prefer simple institutional mechanisms instead of this complexity and something that really perplexes everyone who is a member of this community at the moment. And it is very difficult to reform the European Union. And I think during those decisive intersections when you need 1 and 0, and there is Hungary standing in the middle, I think we have already come to the terms that European countries can vote on excluding Hungary from this decision-making procedure. And it is not the interest of Ukraine to receive support from the European Union alone. It is our interest to support Ukraine because we cannot afford to see Russia annexing other countries, occupying other territories, undermining the sovereignty and independence of other countries by military force, politically, economically, or socially. And I think Ukraine and Georgia are standing as really vivid examples. And European Union has come out with the statement by Germany and France that the French diplomats and the German diplomats are very concerned about the conditions that are taking place in those countries. And most NATO and European countries are supporting Ukraine, but not enough. And if they support militarily, they give the weapons, then there shouldn't be caveats or any kind of restrictions for using those weapons. I was in Turku before February 2022, or during the full scale war already, and that was the time when Finland was not yet in NATO, and the Finnish had this delusion that they can defend their country themselves alone. And I was saying that you are missing the point that you're actually facing the same problems as any of the Baltic states because you don't have the geographical depth. Russia can basically launch missile attacks from its territory against you, and even without stepping on your soil. And then I was asking the Finnish diplomats, would you take your F-35s and the jets and all the artillery that you have to retaliate and shoot against the Russians? Because it means the war with Russia, between Finland and Russia. And they said that they will have to think about this. But I think now we are in this position that we see Ukraine defending, Russians shooting, and really not going into Ukraine because they know the determination and resilience by Ukrainians to win this war. I think Russians are afraid of going into Ukraine. They did it, and we saw how it worked out the first time they were heading towards Kiev. About the European decision makings, I think this is the institution that has to undergo really substantial reforms in terms of qualified decision, qualified majority or unanimity. Of course, not all decisions should be subject to 51% vote, 2/3 or something like that should be enough for really strategic decisions. Similar principles are embedded in multiple constitutions of democratic countries. So if you need to amend the constitution requires 2/3 of the vote to have any reform. So it's really substantial. But in terms of Ukraine, with countries like Ukraine standing in a way, I think this would be really applicable and a really good solution to those decision-making deadlocks.
So we have one more question in the chat, and Diana has a concern about Trump's personal relationships possibly seeping into the political, given that Trump showed admiration for Putin and also Trump's commitment to revenge and retribution, which might be projected against Zelensky. Does this pose any problems for Ukraine?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually. And if you look, for example, at the roster of sanctions Trump has imposed against Russia, I think it is the longest. Second is that both leaders really don't get along, and there was this admiration before the first term. But I think the difficulty is that that Trump saw working with Putin or Russians brought him in the quagmire for him. That he really didn't expect. All his 4 years was actually, investigation. To what extent has the Russian administration meddled in the U.S. presidential election? And it doesn't make him look very good. He also wants to be a strong man, but Putin has made him look weak. And I think also the foreign policy and security policy advisors will overtly tell Trump that since 2012, the Russians are viewing the United States as the enemy number one. And the question is also, what can Trump as a president get out from the cooperation with Russia if he's interested in money? There's no money in Russia, and there is less and less money. There is less and less stability, and I think there is no practical interest because Trump's thinking is like a businessman. There's no practical interest that would drag Trump closer to Vladimir Putin. I think all his rhetoric is very beneficial for the Europeans. So in Central Eastern part of Europe, we tend to look at Trump positively. And actually, we see many of the Biden administration's foreign policy errors, like, for example, being slow with the support, being slow with the decision-making, giving too little, too much, too many restrictions. When you give something, then it's very difficult for Ukraine to plan any kind of defense against the Russian full-scale war.
So Lalo asks, what would you consider to be the most important message for Baltic security advocates and the local Baltic communities in U.S. to get across to the U.S. public to help sustain, support, and create stronger U.S. will for Baltic and Ukraine defense initiatives? So speaking to the heart of advocacy, as Carl was saying.
I think it's a great question by Lelo, and I'm here in the DC, and I'm trying to attend all events to see what kind of priority should the Baltic states set and what kind of messages should we embrace to have closer alliance with Trump America, because looking at all the polls and the mood in the United States, the likelihood that exactly that Trump will win the election is really high. So we have to brace for the possibility that the American voters will choose Trump as the next president, and he will guide then the U.S. foreign and security community for the next 4 years. In the past, if I was very skeptical about his election as a president, then my skepticism disappeared with his choosing of the foreign and security policy establishment. We still quote and refer to the leaders from his administration who wrote about the Putin and his personality, those former military and security think tank community experts who wrote about the personality of Putin and the challenges that he brings to the United States and US-European cooperation. So I would view his foreign policy endeavors during his first term positively, while I would be very critical about Biden's foreign policy approach and messages that he's delivering to Ukraine, for example. If most European countries, minus Germany and France, of course, are allowing to Ukrainian military to strike targets inside of Russia, the question is like, what keeps Biden back? So it's not the Congress anymore. It's basically his own decision. And you cannot win the war if you're not allowed to fight the adversary. And fighting adversary is what Ukrainians are asking for, a good fighting chance, or the equal fighting chance, at least, with the Russians, and equality in this Russia-Ukraine war is hardly possible because Russia is 140 million. The territory is huge. It's a nuclear power. And Ukraine relies on rules, principles, and laws, which is something Russia never does.
Thank you for listening to Baltic Spotlight, produced by the Joint Baltic American National Committee. Connect with us by emailing jbank@jbank.org and follow us on Instagram @jbankbaltics to stay up to date on opportunities for advocacy and the latest updates on Baltic Spotlight. We hope you enjoyed the program.